In the dust-choked year of 1931, when the Ozark Hills were baked to brittle brown and the very air seemed to hold its breath, hope was a currency scarcer than rain. Fields lay fallow, families thinned like cornstalks in a drought, and men of good standing became indistinguishable from beggars overnight. Yet, in the isolated fold of land known as Sparrow Creek Hollow, one man's prosperity seemed an affront to the surrounding destitution. His name was Silas Croft, and his farm was an island of impossible green in a sea of ochre despair. His barns were full, his livestock fat, and his table, the whispers said, never knew want. To the desperate souls drifting through the hollows, Croft was a paradox, a savior with the shadow of a vulture. He offered work where there was none, a plate of food to those who had forgotten the taste of a full meal. But a peculiar pattern had begun to stitch itself into the local lore, a dark tapestry woven from hushed conversations in dimly lit general stores and fearful glances exchanged over church pews. The pattern was one of erasure. Drifters, itinerant workers, whole families who took shelter on the Croft homestead would, after a time, simply cease to be. They would vanish as completely as a morning mist burned away by the unforgiving sun. When questions were asked, and they were asked rarely, the answers were always plausible, delivered with Silas Croft's signature blend of solemn piety and gentle regret. They moved on, he would say, a sad shake of his head. Found better prospects out west. Or they were ungrateful, took my charity and slipped away in the night. The community, bound to Croft by a web of debt and dependency, accepted these explanations. It was easier than confronting the alternative, an unspoken fear that festered beneath the surface of their hardscrabble lives. Then came the twins, Alara and Lyra. They appeared at the edge of the hollow one sweltering afternoon, materializing from the heat haze on the dirt road like apparitions. They were bone-thin, with identical pale faces and eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light. They moved as one entity, their ragged dresses swaying in a silent, synchronized rhythm. They spoke little, and when they did, their voices were a soft, unnerving harmony. They were seeking work, they told the storekeeper, their gazes fixed on some point beyond him. They had heard of a good man, a charitable farmer named Silas Croft. The storekeeper, a man whose ledger was filled with Croft's patronage, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. But he pointed the way. What else could he do? To turn them away was to sentence them to starvation. To send them to Croft felt like something far worse. He watched them walk toward the immaculate white farmhouse on the hill, two slight figures against a vast, indifferent sky, and the silence they left behind was heavier than any scream. For weeks, they were a subject of muted speculation. They were seen working in Croft's fields, their movements precise and tireless. They were seen sitting on his porch in the evenings, small and still as porcelain dolls. Croft, when seen in town, spoke of them with a proprietary pride. Hard workers, he proclaimed. God-fearing girls. He was giving them a chance, a sanctuary from the cruel world. And then, just like the others, they vanished. The rhythm of the hollow resumed its grim cadence, but the twins' disappearance left a different kind of quiet. It was not the quiet of forgetting, but of a held breath, an anticipation of a final, terrible chord. They had been lured to his farm, enticed by the promise of salvation in his infamous root cellar, stocked not just with preserves, but with hope. But as the weeks bled into a month, a different, more terrifying question began to take root in the darkest corners of the Hollow's collective mind. What if the farmer had lured the wrong ones? What if, this time, the secret they carried into that cellar was far more dangerous than his own? The letter that arrived on the desk of the county sheriff in Springfield was an anomaly. It was penned on a scrap of butcher's paper, the script a jagged, almost frantic scrawl, and had been delivered not by the post, but by a rail worker who claimed a stooped old man had pressed it into his hand at a remote crossing, along with a nickel for his trouble. The letter was short and cryptic. It spoke of Sparrow Creek Hollow, of a farmer named Silas Croft, and of a silence that had grown too loud to bear. It mentioned two girls twins who had walked up Croft's Lane and had not walked back down. It ended with a single, chilling sentence. The earth beneath his cellar keeps its secrets, but the hunger is new. The sheriff, a man worn smooth by decades of political compromise and petty rural disputes, read it with a dismissive sigh. It smelled of mountain feuds and moonshine-fueled paranoia. He was about to discard it when his deputy, Thomas Feldman, reached for it. Feldman was new, not yet 30, with a face unlined by cynicism and an earnestness that the older men found both irritating and faintly pathetic. He had come from St. Louis, filled with notions of procedure and justice that had little currency in the hard-bitten Ozark Hills. He still believed that a lawman's duty was to seek the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. He read the note twice, his brow furrowed in concentration. The phrase, "the hunger is new," snagged in his mind. It wasn't the language of a simple grudge. It was poetic and deeply unsettling. "I'll go," he said, the words simple and direct. The sheriff snorted. "Go where? Chasing ghosts in Sparrow Creek? Son, you don't know those people. They're a different breed. They handle their own affairs. And Silas Croft is the closest thing that Hollow has to a king. You go poking around his land, you'll be lucky to come back with your dignity, let alone a case." But Feldman was insistent. The disappearance of two young women, no matter their station in life, demanded investigation. It was the law. The sheriff, seeing an opportunity to teach the young deputy a lesson in futility, finally acquiesced, granting him 3 days. 3 days, Feldman. Then you come back here and you learn to file reports and leave the boogeymen to the storytellers. The journey to Sparrow Creek Hollow was a descent. The further Feldman drove his Ford Model A, the more the landscape seemed to close in on him. The roads narrowed, the trees grew thicker, their branches tangling overhead to form a canopy that choked the sunlight. The air grew heavy and still, smelling of damp earth and decay. When he finally rolled into the cluster of weathered buildings that constituted the hollow's center, it felt as though he had crossed an invisible border into another time. The few people he saw stopped what they were doing to watch him, their faces impassive, their eyes holding a flat, guarded curiosity that bordered on hostility. He was an outsider, a symbol of a world and a set of rules that had no jurisdiction here. His first stop was the local constable, a portly, sweat-stained man named Beauregard who served more as Croft's man than as an officer of the county. Feldman found him tipped back in a chair on the porch of the general store, fanning himself with his hat. He presented his badge and stated his purpose. Beauregard listened, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across his face. "Twins," he drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Feldman's polished shoes. "Folks come and go. It's the Depression. Croft, he tries to help. Some ain't worth the trouble. They likely stole him blind and ran off." Feldman pressed, mentioning the anonymous letter. Beauregard's eyes hardened. "Some old fool with a grudge. Probably someone Croft rightly denied a handout. You're wasting your time, deputy, and you're bothering good people." The message was clear. There was no investigation to be had here. There was only the official story, a story authored by Silas Croft and enforced by the silence of an entire community. Every door Feldman knocked on yielded the same result. A polite but firm denial, a paean to Croft's generosity, a suggestion that he should look elsewhere. The twins had never been there. Or if they had left. The stories were fluid, contradictory, but the conclusion was always the same. Leave it be. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Feldman felt the weight of his failure. The sheriff had been right. This place was a closed circle, impenetrable. He was an intruder, and the hollow was quietly, patiently rejecting him. The second day dawned with a suffocating humidity that promised a storm. Defeated, Feldman was preparing to leave Sparrow Creek Hollow, the sheriff's mocking voice already echoing in his mind. He sat in his car, parked near the dilapidated church, staring at the Croft farm, a pristine wound on the horizon. The white paint of the house seemed to glow with an almost supernatural intensity against the darkening sky. It was a monument to a lie, and the entire hollow was its congregation. He was turning the ignition key when a sharp rap on the passenger side window made him jump. An old man stood there, stooped and wizened, his face a road map of wrinkles. He was dressed in filthy buckskins, and he smelled of wood smoke and pine needles. He gestured with a gnarled finger, a silent command to follow. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a flicker of urgent intelligence. Feldman, with nothing to lose, shut off the engine and followed. The man led him away from a main path, into a tangled thicket behind the church cemetery. He moved with a surprising agility, his silence absolute. They stopped in a small clearing, hidden from the road by a curtain of wild grapevine. "They call me Hemlock," the old man rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. Lived in these hills before Silas Croft was anything more than a greedy boy with cruel eyes. Feldman knew at once this was the author of the letter. "You wrote to the sheriff." Hemlock nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant farmhouse. "Wasted ink, I figured. The law in these parts is bought and paid for. But I saw you a skin, saw them shut in their mouths and their doors. You got a different look about you. You might actually listen." Hemlock had been watching Silas Croft for 40 years. He spoke of a long, slow reign of terror, a quiet culling that had been happening for decades. He told Feldman about a boy who had stolen an apple from Croft's orchard and was never seen again. He spoke of a family who had argued with Croft over wages and whose cabin mysteriously burned to the ground a week later. The bodies inside, too charred to be identified. These were stories the Hollow knew but refused to speak. Folklore built on a foundation of real terror. "Croft, he preys on the weak," Hemlock continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The ones no one will miss. Drifters, orphans. The depression, it's a feast for him. A river of lost souls flowing right to his door." He had seen the twins, Alara and Lyra, the day they arrived. He had watched them from his perch in the hills, a knot of dread tightening in his gut. They were different, he said, a strange look in his eyes. Not broken like the others. Not yet. They walked like they had a purpose. But they went to his house all the same. I saw Silas lead them to the root cellar. He was smiling that preacher smile of his. And they ain't been seen since. Feldman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coming storm. The cellar. The letter mentioned the cellar. Hemlock pointed a trembling finger towards the Croft property. "It ain't just for jams and potatoes. It's where he takes them. It's the last place they see. But something's different this time. For a month now, Croft, he's been agitated. He paces the property at night. I seen him from the ridge. He looks like a man haunted. He looks like a man who's lost control of his own trap." Hemlock's words provided the first solid piece of ground in a swamp of rumor and denial. This wasn't just paranoia. It was testimony. "I can't get a warrant based on this," Feldman said, his mind racing. "Beauregard will laugh me out of the county." "A warrant?" Hemlock scoffed. "You think a piece of paper means anything to that devil? You go that farm. You talk to him. You look him in the eye. But you watch his hands. And you watch that cellar door. There's a new lock on it. A big, shiny one. Brand new. You ask yourself why a man needs a lock like that for his canned peaches." The old man turned to leave, melting back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. "The storm's coming," he called back over his shoulder. "Storms are good for covering things up and for washing things out." Feldman stood alone in the clearing, the air thick with the smell of rain. The pieces were disparate, jagged, but they were beginning to form a picture of unimaginable darkness. He had an eyewitness. He had a location. And he had a motive, however monstrous. The community's silence was not just fear, it was complicity. They were all tending Silas Croft's garden of horrors. And now, armed with Hemlock's terrible knowledge, Feldman knew he had to go to that pristine white farmhouse and confront the man who stood at its center. Armed with a new, terrifying clarity, Deputy Feldman drove his car not away from Sparrow Creek Hollow, but directly towards its heart of power, the Croft farm. He formulated a pretext, a story about searching for a runaway boy from a neighboring county, a fiction flimsy enough to be seen through, but solid enough to demand a civil response. The closer he got, the more the farm's perfection seemed obscene. The fences were perfectly whitewashed, the fields were meticulously tilled, and the house itself stood proud and unblemished, a stark white lie against the bruised, stormy sky. As he pulled up the long gravel driveway, the front door opened, and Silas Croft emerged onto the porch. He was exactly as the townspeople had described him, tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of silver hair and a face that was handsome in a severe, patriarchal way. He wore clean overalls and a placid expression. He wiped his hands on a rag as he watched Feldman approach, his eyes a pale, assessing blue. "Can I help you, son?" His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, the kind of voice that could soothe a crying child or condemn a sinner from the pulpit with equal authority. Feldman introduced himself, his badge feeling small and insignificant in the face of this man's serene confidence. He told his fabricated story about the runaway, watching Croft's face for any flicker of deception. There was none. Croft listened with an air of paternal concern, his head tilted slightly. "A runaway, you say? Lord have mercy on the boy. The world is a hard place for the young and lost. I'll keep an eye out, of course. My men and I, we cover a lot of ground. You're welcome to search my property, deputy. I have nothing to hide." The offer was disarming, a masterful stroke of reverse psychology. To accept felt like an accusation. To refuse felt like a retreat. Feldman chose the former. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Croft. Just to be thorough." Croft smiled, a warm, benevolent expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Of course. Duty is a heavy burden. Let me show you around myself." What followed was a surreal tour of a perfectly functioning, prosperous farm. Croft led Feldman through the cavernous barn, the air sweet with the smell of hay and livestock. He pointed out his prize bull, his healthy milk cows. He spoke of crop rotation and soil health with the passion of a scholar. At every turn, he was the image of the virtuous farmer, a man in harmony with his land, blessed by God's favor. Feldman spoke with a few of the farmhands, sullen men with downcast eyes who mumbled rehearsed praises of their employer. They had seen no runaway boy. They had seen nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, Feldman felt a current of dread beneath the placid surface. The perfection was a performance. The neatness felt sterile, like a room that had been scrubbed clean of a terrible stain. His gaze kept drifting towards a small, sturdy structure built into the side of a low hill behind the main house, the root cellar. The door was made of thick, dark wood, reinforced with iron bands. And just as Hemlock had described, it was secured with a brand-new, oversized brass padlock that gleamed with an unholy light against the weathered timber. As they passed it, Feldman paused. "That's a sturdy-looking cellar." Croft followed his gaze, his smile unwavering. "A man must protect his harvest, deputy, from the elements, and from those who would take what isn't theirs. That cellar holds the fruits of a year's hard labor. It's the most valuable thing on this farm." The words were layered with a double meaning that made the hair on Feldman's arm stand on end. He thought of the twins, of the drifters, of the long line of the forgotten who had walked this path. The fruits of a year's hard labor. "And that lock," Feldman pressed, his voice casual, "seems a bit much for keeping out raccoons." For the first time, a shadow crossed Croft's face, a flicker of irritation so fleeting it was almost imperceptible. "These are desperate times," he said, his tone hardening slightly. "Desperate men do desperate things. A little extra security is just common sense." The tour concluded on the porch. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering the dust. The wind was picking up, rattling the leaves of the great oak that shaded the house. "A storm's coming," Croft said, his gaze on the horizon. It sounded less like an observation and more like a pronouncement. "You'd best be on your way, deputy. The roads will be treacherous." It was a dismissal, polite but firm. Feldman had seen everything and nothing. He had been shown a perfect facade and had found no visible cracks. But he had seen the lock. He had felt the coldness in Croft's eyes. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the truth of Sparrow Creek Hollow lay behind that brass-locked door. As he drove away, the heavens opened and the rain came down in a torrential, blinding sheet. The storm Hemlock had spoken of had arrived. It was time to wash things out. That night, The storm raged with a biblical fury. Wind howled through the hollows like a tormented spirit, and rain fell in such dense curtains that the world was reduced to the few feet illuminated by Feldman's lantern. It was the perfect cover. Leaving his car hidden in a copse of pines a mile away, he made his way back to the Croft farm on foot, the mud sucking at his boots with each step. The pristine White House was dark, a ghost ship on a sea of tempestuous night. There were no lights, no sounds of life, only the roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain on the tin roofs of the outbuildings. He moved with a predator's stealth, his senses on high alert. The farm, so welcoming by day, was now a place of profound menace. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every creak of a branch sounded like a footstep behind him. He reached the root cellar, its heavy door a dark maw in the hillside. The brass lock gleamed in the swaying light of his lantern, a defiant golden eye in the oppressive gloom. He had brought tools from his car, a heavy crowbar and a set of iron files. He was a lawman, and he was about to commit a felony. The irony was not lost on him, but the concept of law felt like a distant, abstract thing in this place. Here, there was only the cellar and the secrets it held. He worked first on the hasp, trying to pry the thick metal from the door jamb. The wood was old but incredibly dense, and the iron bands reinforcing it were set deep. Sweat and rain streamed down his face as he strained, the crowbar groaning in protest. It wouldn't budge. He switched to the lock itself, jamming the tip of the crowbar into the shackle and trying to use leverage to snap it. The brass was stronger than it looked. It resisted, mocking his efforts. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping fear that he would fail, that Croft would awaken, that he would be found. He thought of Hemlock's words, of the twins, of the hunger that was new. He shoved the crowbar harder, putting his entire body weight into it. There was a sickening crack, not of metal, but of wood. He had splintered the door frame around the hasp. It was ugly, but it was a start. He worked the crowbar into the new opening, splintering more wood, tearing at the frame until, with a final desperate heave, the entire locking mechanism ripped free from the jamb with a sound like a gunshot. For a moment, Feldman froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening for any sound from the house. There was only the storm. He pulled the heavy door open. A wave of cold, musty air washed over him, thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting potatoes, and something else. Something acrid and metallic, the faint, unmistakable scent of old fear. He held his lantern high and descended the stone steps. The cellar was larger than he had expected, the walls lined with shelves groaning under the weight of countless mason jars. Preserved peaches, beans, tomatoes, a testament to Croft's industry. It was a perfect, orderly pantry. But this was only the first chamber. At the far end, partially hidden behind a stack of empty crates, was another door. This one was different. It was newer, made of raw, unfinished planks, and it had no handle, only a simple sliding bolt on the outside. A cold dread, heavier than the storm outside, settled over Feldman. This was not part of a normal root cellar. This was an addition. This was a cage. He slid the bolt, his hand trembling slightly, and pulled the door open. The space beyond was small, no bigger than a closet, and utterly bare save for a thin, stained mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner. Shackles, their chains bolted directly into the stone wall, lay coiled on the floor like sleeping snakes. This was it. This was the place Hemlock had described, the end of the line for the forgotten. He ran his fingers over the cold iron of the shackles. They were worn smooth in places from use. He knelt, bringing the lantern closer to the floor. There, tucked into a crack between two of the flagstones, was a small object. He carefully worked it free. It was not a locket or a button. It was a book, a small, hand-stitched journal made from folded scraps of paper and bound with twine. The cover was a piece of calico, faded and worn. He opened it. The first page was inscribed with two names, written in the same delicate, looping script, Ilara and Lyra. He had found their story. He sat on the edge of the foul mattress, the storm raging above him, and in the flickering light of his lantern, he began to read. The journal was unlike anything Deputy Feldman had ever seen. It was not a singular diary, but a dual narrative, a conversation on paper between two minds that were so intertwined they seemed to share a single consciousness. Alara's entries were written in black ink, her script precise and analytical. Lyra's were in a faint, pencil-written scrawl, more poetic and emotional, often weaving in and around her sister's words like a vine. Together, they painted a picture of a life that was both horrifying and strangely beautiful in its resilience. They did not begin with their arrival at the Croft farm, but much earlier, in a place they called the Hollow of Whispers, a remote, brutal corner of the Ozarks where their family, the Cades, had lived for generations. The Inbred secret from the sensationalist title that would one day be imagined for their story was both true and a profound misinterpretation. Generations of isolation had indeed led to a tangled family tree, but what the outside world would call a degeneracy, the Cades considered a distillation, a purification of their bloodline. The true secret was not in their genes, but in their philosophy, a code of survival passed down from mother to daughter, a grim ledger of wrongs, and a methodology for balancing the books. They wrote of their mother, a woman who taught them that the world was divided into two types of people, the takers and the taken. The Cades, she insisted, would never be the latter. She taught them to read not just books, but people. She taught them the art of appearing weak, of using the prejudices of others as a shield and a weapon. Their family's secret was a form of generational justice, a dark and patient martial art of the soul. Feldman's hands grew cold as he read of their older sister, Serafina. She had been the first to leave the Hollow, a girl with a wild spirit who dreamed of a world beyond the claustrophobic confines of their clan. She had vanished a year prior, and the last anyone had heard, she had found work with a prosperous, pious farmer in Sparrow Creek Hollow. The Cades had sent out feelers, using their network of distant kin and sympathizers, and the whispers that came back were dark. They spoke of a cellar, of a man who collected lost souls. The law would not help them. The Cades knew this instinctively. The law was for people who owned things, for men like Silas Croft. So, they had turned to their own code. The journal then shifted to Alara and Lyra's mission. It was not a flight from poverty. It was a calculated infiltration. They had starved themselves for weeks to appear more desperate, more broken. They had practiced their roles, the timid, silent twins, until it was second nature. Alara wrote, "He must see us as prey. A predator does not suspect the lamb of carrying a knife." Lyra added beneath it, "The spider invites the flies. But we are wasps." They described their arrival at the farm, their first meeting with Croft. Alara's entry was a cold assessment of his vanity, his barely concealed avarice, his hunger for power over the weak. Lyra wrote of the emptiness in his eyes, the look of a man who had consumed so much he was no longer capable of being full. They documented their time at the farm, the long days of labor, the nights spent listening to the house settle, learning its rhythms. They noted the other farmhands' fear, the way they never met Croft's gaze. They detailed how Croft would single one of them out, usually Lyra, for small, unsettling kindnesses, a piece of candy, a pat on the head, his fingers lingering too long. It was the grooming, the slow, patient process of breaking a thing before you devour it. Then came the night he made his move. He came to their small attic room, his face flushed, smelling of whiskey. He spoke of a special task, of a reward for their hard work. He was going to give them their own space, he said, a secure room in the cellar where they would be safe. He led them down, his hand on the small of Lyra's back. Alara wrote, his touch was a brand. The debt was now due. The final entries before Stark, new chapter were written in the cellar itself. They described the moment Croft locked them in the small, foul-smelling room. They wrote of his promises to take care of them, his voice thick with a hideous, feigned tenderness. The last line in that section was from Lyra. The spider has returned to his web. He does not know the web is no longer his. Feldman's heart pounded in his chest. The narrative in the journal had shifted abruptly. The ink changed, the handwriting growing more hurried, more intense. This section, penned entirely by Alara, was a procedural account of their revenge. It was chilling in its precision. Day 1, she wrote. He believes us trapped. He does not know we spent the nights not sleeping, but exploring. He does not know that generations of Cades have learned to see in the dark, to test for loose stones, to understand the language of old foundations. The twins had not been idle during their weeks at the farm. While Croft saw them as docile laborers, they were, in fact, casing his fortress. They had discovered that the root cellar was not a single, solid structure, but an amalgamation of different constructions. The main chamber was old, part of the original homestead. But Croft, in his paranoia and cruelty, had dug deeper. The cell they were in was a newer addition, and in digging it, he had unwittingly created a weakness. Lyra, with her smaller frame, had found it, a section of the back wall where the mortar between the field stones was crumbling, leading not to open earth, but to another, even older space. It was a forgotten cold room, a small, brick-lined cavern dug into the coldest part of the hill, likely used by the original settlers for storing meat and ice. It was a tomb in waiting. The journal detailed how they worked in absolute silence, using a spoon pilfered from the kitchen and their bare hands to scrape away the failing mortar. Croft would visit them once a day, bringing a meager plate of food, his eyes gleaming with a sick, proprietary pleasure. He would stand at the door of their cell, speaking to them, enjoying their captivity. They, in turn, played their parts to perfection, cowering, weeping, begging. It was all meticulously documented. He feeds on fear, Ilera wrote. We give him a feast. The night of the turning point was described with a terrifying lack of emotion. Croft, emboldened by their apparent submission and a bottle of whiskey, had unbolted their door and entered their cell. It was the mistake they had been waiting for. The journal entry was stark. He was strong, but we are two, and we are Cade. Lyra used the bucket. I used the chain. He underestimated our weight. He underestimated our will. He did not scream for long. They had subdued him, dragged him through the opening they had created in the wall, and into the hidden cold room. There, they had used the very shackles intended for them to bind him to a thick iron ring set in the wall, a remnant of the room's past as a primitive smokehouse. The rest of the journal was a log of their captor's decline. They had become the zookeepers of their monster. They gave him a fraction of the food he had given them, just enough to keep him alive. They gave him water, but only when his throat was cracked and raw. They did not speak to him. They did not torture him physically. They simply allowed his own wickedness to consume him in the cold, absolute dark. Ilera wrote, justice is not a single act, but a slow process of reduction. We are rendering him down to what he truly is, a terrified animal in a cage. Feldman felt sick. He flipped to the last page. The entry was from only a day or two before. It was Lyra's pencil script, written with a shaky hand. He has stopped yelling. He only whispers now. He whispers for his mother. He whispers for God. The hunger in the cellar is new, Ilera says. It is his. The letter. The phrase that had snagged in Feldman's mind. The hunger is new. It wasn't about the twins being hungry. It was about Croft. The old man, Hemlock, had not been wrong when he'd seen Croft pacing, agitated. But he'd been seeing the wrong man. The twins, free from their cell, had been impersonating their captor, one of them wearing his hat and coat, pacing the property at night to maintain the illusion that all was well, while the other stood watch. Feldman's lantern trembled, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the stone walls. The journal had given him the truth, but it was a truth more complex and horrifying than he could have imagined. These girls were not just victims. They were avengers, executing a sentence passed down through their bloodline. He looked back at the opening in the wall of the cell, a dark, jagged hole leading deeper into the earth. The journal was a map. He knew where he had to go. He had to see. He crawled through the tight opening, the damp earth staining his clothes, and emerged into the cold room. The air was frigid and foul, thick with the smell of despair. He raised his lantern, and the light fell upon the figure chained to the wall. It was Silas Croft, but it was not the proud, formidable man he had met on the porch. The thing in the chains was a skeletal ruin, his silver hair matted with filth, his eyes, when they finally lifted to meet the light, were vast, hollow pools of primal terror. He flinched, a pathetic, animal sound escaping his cracked lips. He was broken. He was reduced. The twins had completed their work. The sight of Silas Croft, the Hollow's patriarch reduced to a gibbering wreck in his own secret dungeon, was a tableau of such perfect, grotesque justice that it momentarily paralyzed Deputy Feldman. He stood there, lantern held aloft, the light carving the scene from the absolute darkness. The chained skeletal man, the weeping stone walls, the faint, sweetish smell of human decay. This was the source of the community's rot, the monster at the heart of the maze, now brought low not by the law, but by a force far older and more personal. Croft's eyes, devoid of the cunning intelligence Feldman had seen before, fixed on the lantern light with a desperate, pathetic hope. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He was a husk, hollowed out by fear and starvation, a vessel emptied of its pride and filled with pure animal suffering. Feldman felt a wave of nausea, followed by a profound and unsettling sense of moral vertigo. He was a man of the law. His duty was clear, to rescue this man, to arrest the women who had done this to him. But the words of the journal echoed in his mind. He feeds on fear. We give him a feast. This was not a simple act of kidnapping and torture. It was a reckoning, a balancing of a ledger written in blood and tears over decades. Rescuing Croft felt like a betrayal of every soul that had vanished into the silence of this farm. As he stood, caught in this paralysis of conscience, a faint sound from the outer cellar made him freeze. A scraping sound, a footstep on the stone stairs. They had returned. He extinguished his lantern, plunging the cold room into a blackness so complete it felt like a physical weight. He drew his service revolver, the cold steel a small, inadequate comfort in his hand. He flattened himself against the damp brick wall, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He heard them enter the main cellar, their movements quiet and sure. They knew this space intimately. He heard the faint clink of a glass jar, the rustle of a sack. Then silence. One of them was coming towards the cell. He saw a sliver of light appear as the inner door was pushed open. A single lantern, held low, illuminated the small, empty cell. A figure stepped inside, slight and draped in a simple dress. He couldn't see her face, only her silhouette against the light. She placed the lantern on the floor, then knelt, her back to the opening of the cold room. She was leaving a small plate of food and a cup of water, just as the journal had described. The methodical, almost ritualistic nature of the act was more chilling than any overt act of violence. This was their new routine, their new purpose. This was what they had become. Feldman knew he had to act. He could not stay hidden in the dark with this broken man forever. He took a steadying breath, his thumb finding the hammer of his revolver. "Don't move," he said, his voice loud and unnatural in the suffocating quiet. The figure in the cell froze. There was no gasp, no startled cry, just a sudden, absolute stillness. Slowly, she turned her head. In the dim, uplit glow of the lantern, he saw her face. It was one of the twins, he couldn't tell which, and her expression was not one of fear. It was one of cold, weary resignation, as if she had been expecting this interruption all along. Then, a second voice came from the main cellar, calm and clear. "Alara? Is someone there?" The twin in the cell, Alara, slowly rose to her feet. She turned to face the dark opening where Feldman was hidden. "Yes, Lyra," she said, her voice a low, even tone. "The law has found us." There was a moment of silence, and then the second twin, Lyra, appeared at the door of the cell, holding a small, sharpened trowel, its tip caked with dirt. Her eyes, identical to her sister's, were wide and dark, but they too held no panic, only a deep, ancient sorrow. They stood there, the two sisters framed in the doorway, their faces illuminated by the single lantern on the floor. They were no longer the waifs from the road, the victims of a predator. They were something else entirely. They were priestesses of a dark rite, guardians of a terrible justice, and their work had just been interrupted. The two sisters stood in the doorway of the inner cell, their identical faces impassive in the flickering lantern light. They looked at the dark opening where Feldman was concealed, their gaze not accusatory, but deeply, profoundly weary. The one with the trowel, Lyra, took a half-step forward, her knuckles white around the handle of the tool. Alara, her hands empty, placed a restraining hand on her sister's arm. "It is done, Lyra," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The circle is closed." Feldman stepped out of the cold room, his revolver held steady, the lantern in his other hand casting his own long, distorted shadow against the wall. The twins did not flinch. They simply watched him, their dark eyes reflecting the wavering light. They were so small, so slight, he could likely overpower them both with one arm. But their stillness held a power that belied their physical size. It was the power of absolute conviction. "It's over," Feldman said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. "You're both under arrest. For kidnapping. For torture." Lyra let out a sound that was almost a laugh, a short, bitter puff of air. "Arrest?" she whispered, her voice laced with a contemptuous disbelief. "You came for us? Not for him." She gestured with her head towards the darkness behind Feldman, towards the whimpering ruin of Silas Croft. Alara's gaze was more direct, more analytical. She was studying Feldman, assessing him. "You read the journal," she stated. It wasn't a question. Feldman nodded, his grip tightening on the revolver. "I know what he did. I know what you did." "Then you know this is not a crime," Alara said, her voice devoid of emotion. "This is a correction, a balancing. The world is full of men like him. They take, and they leave behind ghosts. Your law protects them, is written for them by them. Our law is for the ghosts. It is the only law that matters in the places your light doesn't reach." Her words struck Feldman with the force of a physical blow. She was articulating the very conflict that was tearing him apart. He was an agent of that distant, imperfect light, standing in a place of absolute darkness, tried to apply rules that had no meaning here. "He took our sister." Lyra's voice was a low, mournful keen. "Her name was Seraphina. He broke her in this very room. We found a piece of her dress, tucked into the wall for a keepsake. He collects trophies." She held up the trowel. "We have been digging. There are others. So many others. Their bones are mixed in with the dirt floor of his pigsty. Does your law care for them? Will you arrest the dirt? Will you put the earth on trial?" The raw, righteous fury in her voice was devastating. Feldman had no answer. He was a deputy, armed with a gun and a badge and a book of statutes. They were armed with a grief that had been honed into a weapon, a philosophy of vengeance forged over generations of abuse. "What you did here, this is not justice," he finally managed to say, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "This is revenge. Is there a difference?" Alara countered, her gaze unwavering. "When justice is blind, revenge must see. When justice is silent, revenge must scream. We are our sister's voice. We are the voices of all the ones he buried in silence. If that is a crime, then we are guilty. But we are not ashamed." She took a step forward, placing herself between Feldman and her sister. "So what will you do now, deputy? Will you take us away? Will you unchain the monster and tell him he is free to hunt again? Will you tell the people of this hollow that their silence was rewarded, that their king is back on his throne?" The questions hung in the cold, damp air, each one a stone added to the crushing weight on Feldman's shoulders. He looked from their resolute, unyielding faces to the dark hole behind him, where Silas Croft still lay chained. He thought of the sheriff in Springfield, of the paperwork of a trial. He imagined trying to explain this to a judge and jury, trying to make them understand the generations of pain that had culminated in this one terrible act in a secret cellar. He saw Silas Croft, cleaned up, his silver hair combed, his resonant voice filling the courtroom with lies and piety, painting these two girls as feral, inbred monsters. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that the world would believe him. The twins watched him, their expressions unreadable. They had presented him with their truth, and now they were waiting for his judgment. The choice was his. The lantern hissed, its fuel running low. Its light sputtered, casting the cellar in a frantic, strobe-like rhythm of light and shadow. In the pulsating darkness, the faces of the twins seemed to shift, one moment young and vulnerable, the next ancient and hard as stone. Deputy Feldman stood at the crossroads of his entire belief system. Before him stood the perpetrators of a horrifying crime, a crime of methodical, cold-blooded torture. Behind him, in the stinking dark, lay their victim, a man who was also a monster of unimaginable cruelty. To enforce the law as written was to commit a moral atrocity. To allow this savage justice to stand was to abandon the very foundation of his identity as a lawman. "You will be judged," Feldman said, his voice strained. "A court will hear this." Alara's smile was a sad, knowing thing. "Your court?" she asked. "A room of men who look like him, who think like him. Men who see two strange girls from the hills and see only what they want to see. We have already been judged, deputy. We were judged the day we were born female in a world that lets men like Silas Croft flourish." The simplicity and truth of her statement were irrefutable. Feldman's mind reeled. He thought of the community above, sleeping in their beds, their complicity the very soil in which Croft's evil had been allowed to grow. They had sacrificed the nameless and the weak for their own perceived safety and prosperity. The twins had merely refused to be another sacrifice. They had become the wolves the sheep had been feeding to a larger wolf. He lowered his revolver. The gesture was small, but in the charged atmosphere of the cellar, it felt monumental. The twins watched him, their bodies still tense, but a flicker of something new. Not hope, but a deep, shared understanding passed between them. "What will you do?" Lyra asked again, her voice softer this time, the sharp edge of her anger blunted by a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. Feldman did not have an answer. For the first time in his life, he was truly lost. The clear lines of right and wrong had dissolved into a murky, featureless gray. He saw a path forward, a story he could tell. He could report that he had found the cellar empty, that the twins had fled, and that in his search he had discovered the remains of previous victims, forcing an official investigation into Silas Croft, who had also conveniently disappeared, a fugitive from his own dark history. It was a lie, a fabrication, an obstruction of justice. It was also, perhaps, the only way to achieve a semblance of true justice in this forsaken place. He would be leaving the twins to their fate, to their dark work. He would be condemning Silas Croft to a slow, unhallowed death in the cold earth. He would be an accessory to their crime. He looked at the twins, at their thin frames, their old eyes, their shared and terrible burden. They were not just the products of their family's brutal code. They were the products of the world's indifference. They were the consequence of every turn back, every hushed voice, every time a good person did nothing. His own inaction now would be a different kind of choice. It would be an act of quiet, radical judgment. He would be leaving the verdict in their hands. The lantern gave a final, desperate flicker and died, plunging the cellar into absolute blackness. The only sound was the drip of water, the faint, pathetic whimpering of the man in the chains, and the ragged sound of Feldman's own breathing. He stood there in the dark, a lawman with no law, a judge with no jurisdiction. He had come to Sparrow Creek Hollow, seeking a simple truth, and had found a moral abyss. What is justice in a land that God has forgotten? What is a crime when the victim is a monster? And what does a good man do when the only right choice is to walk away and let the darkness consume itself? The questions offered no answers. There, in the cold, silent earth beneath the pristine white farmhouse, Deputy Thomas Feldman was left with only the weight of his choice, a secret he would carry for the rest of his days, a quiet testament to the night he looked into the face of a perfect, horrifying revenge and chose to see justice.